about the times that.
Thanks for my card. And at 20 to the next. Next Monday, is it? Still having wrong.
Sounds not bad, but it will be when you get stop share.
We're ready when you guys are. Good. Another minute or so. Yep. Those of you around the table that may not be aware, chair of the committee, Supervisor Salath, is dealing with a pretty tough health issue. He's got kidney stones. So he would much prefer to be at the internal audit committee meeting this morning.
Oh, absolutely.
Still, so keep him in your prayers. That's not a fun to deal with.
My brother had him in Mexico and he was walking into the clinic to get checked out. He had the cowboy behind him. And he passed out in the doorway. He woke up, he said, asked what happened. He says, well, Don David walked into the doorway and he went, that's it.
The end.
I've never had a baby, but I hear it's just as bad as having. Okay, Monty.
All right, very good. Good morning. I'd like to welcome you to the August meeting of the LCTCS Board of Supervisors Audit Committee. Thank you for joining us today. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you that the Audit Committee meeting is being live streamed. And I will turn for the Audit Committee chair call to order to Chair Mount.
So I'll call the meeting to order and certainly we miss our chairperson who's not here today, Chair Slaff, but I'm filling in for him and I'll do my very best. With that in mind, we're short one member as far as our quorum, so I'm going to assign all four of my fellow colleagues, Patrick Johnson, Stevie Smith, Stevie Toops, and Matthew Wood, to also be a part of our committee for this morning, if you would please. Okay, next if we'll stand and Stevie Toops, would you lead us in our pledge?
Love to.
I
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you for that. Next, we'll have our roll call.
Okay, you have Chair Salat is absent. Supervisor Burke is absent. Supervisor Bradford. Present. Supervisor Mount
Present.
is present. And we have the addition of Supervisor Johnson.
Present.
Is present. Supervisor Smith.
Present.
Is present. Supervisor Toops.
Present.
Is present. Supervisor Wood.
Present.
Is present. We do have a quorum.
Okay, excellent. I'd like to request a motion to approve the April 12th, 2023 meeting minutes that were sent to you. I see there's a second. Is there any objection to the motion on the floor? Hearing none, that motion passes. Now I'd like to ask Jeff Fleming to review the internal audit reports and projects in progress. Jeff.
Thank you, Supervisor. Thank everybody for being here. This is my first audit committee meeting, so let's make it a memorable one.
We'll work on that for you.
First thing I want to go over, and I think this is particularly relevant because we have some new faces here. This is our year-end report for the 22-23 fiscal year. We're required to report this by Louisiana law, and also the auditing standards that we abide by required to update our audit committee on what we accomplished in the previous fiscal year. Overall, we completed 4 of our 6 projects that we set out to do, and that produced 12 reports. One of the projects that we did not complete in the fiscal year 23 is actually being conducted as we speak. So it's a carryover to the 24 audit plan, which I'll present after this. Also, the one project that we are delaying for an indeterminate time is a review of foundations. There's some changes going on about foundation leadership. So we figured we'd put it on hold and wait for a better time in the future to take a review of those. A good amount of our time during the fiscal year is spent supporting our colleges. They send requests for ethics opinions, accounting opinions. That's where Charles comes in. He's my accounting guru. internal audit, internal control questions, potential fraud issues. So about 10 to 15% of our time is spent there, which I don't mind because I find the more people reach out to us, the better relationship we have, and they give us ideas for future projects. And the best projects that we ever do here are the ones where the college calls us and asks us for help rather than us saying, hey, we're coming. You just get a much better end product. To go over what the reports that we issued in the previous fiscal year, remote access review. This was spurred by all of our colleges after COVID. When COVID hit, purchased a lot of laptops to provide the faculty, staff, students so they could remote work. And this was just more of an asset review to make sure the controls that we had in place of our assets prior were being carried out on, hundreds and hundreds of new laptops coming in. Also, those laptops create another point of entry for bad actors, cybersecurity issues. We found no issues during our review there. Next was agency accounts. With this, and just like I mentioned, colleges called us often asking questions about student organizations. We have a student organization that wants to do this. They have this money. Can they do it? We have a student organization that has $10,000 in the bank, but they haven't met for 5 years. Often what you'll see is these colleges have a student that comes on campus. They're a leader. They want to have change and they want to put their mark on the college. They create an organization. While they're there, it's thriving, but when they leave, it kind of goes by the wayside. That money's sitting there and the colleges are kind of like, hey, what can we do with this money? So our goal was to identify the amounts held in custody by our colleges and give them guidance on how to handle these dormant accounts.
And Jim, just to that point, just a note to the members, that report or that work that they did previously also resulted in a policy revision that the board adopted a couple months ago.
Right.
On student organizations. Yeah.
Right. And what we have some of the things we learned from this report will trickle into the audit plan for the next year, which I'll get into. Next was a review of the Clery Act. The Clery Act, if you're not familiar with that, is it's a federal law that requires our colleges to report crime statistics, not only on the campus, but in the surrounding areas. With these federal compliance, on the surface, it's crime statistics. Yeah, we do crime statistics, but when you dig into this, there's probably 30 requirements of this act. And those are the ones that concern me when I go out to the colleges and we talk about these things and say, hey, are you doing X, Y, Z? And they're like, I didn't even know that was a requirement of Clery Act. So what we did was we laid out the requirements, sent out a survey, found out what they were doing and what they weren't, and identified their blind spots. And that way, a lot of the fixes that we found, we had a few recommendations, but a lot of them could be done in a day or two. It's stuff they're doing, but they're not documenting. And as an auditor, I'm not an external auditor, but I know how they work. And if you don't have the documentation, it's like you're not doing it at all, and they're going to write you up. So that project produced, I think, a lot of good change. We're going to revisit that in the next, probably next calendar year, and I anticipate there'll be no issues because, like I said, a lot of the fixes were very simple. Next report was this was Mike's baby. The previous director, his last audit he ever did was on the CAG 20, which is the Consensus Audit Guidelines. Basically, it's what our colleges have adopted to address their cybersecurity risks. It's a control matrix where you go through and are we doing X, Y, Z, go through the list. We found that the colleges were on the road to doing the right thing. It's a lot of it's dependent on resources. The colleges with more resources are a little further along than the colleges who, might have one or two IT staff, and they're working on it. So this is something we're going to revisit. It's actually in the next audit plan. And we'll see where they are, but overall, I think we're getting there. I know that's not definitive. You want an auditor to say good or bad, but it wasn't that type of report.
Is it fair to say that almost anything in the cybersecurity space
Absolutely.
is iterative? Right?
Yes, yeah.
These are the issues we're dealing with today, but tomorrow's issues may look very different.
Right.
An audit of these standards might look different 3 years from now than it does now.
Absolutely. And in fact, it's funny you mentioned that when we started the project, it was the CAG 20, but when we issued the report, it's now the CAG 18. So again, it's always changing. It'll probably change. They'll probably change CAG to something else.
And Jeff, not that they got, even though they have fewer standards, those standards are wider.
Right.
Instead of this, it's now
Yeah.
that.
Really an accounting trick. 20 to 18 and it got
A wider net.
the next project I want to talk about is we internally call it the HERP project, but it was the COVID-19 grants and related financial projection. This was requested by Joe. He asked us to look into 3 questions. However, colleges use their COVID-19 funds, as the federal programs go away, what will be the impact on our cash flows? And if the enrollment conditions stay the same, what is that projection with the COVID-19 funds out of the coffers? This is probably one of the most intensive projects we ever done because it had dealt with every college, every CFO. Charles led it up. I can't thank him enough. Without him, we wouldn't have been able to get this done. We answered those questions. Again, it's kind of a gray area because we can't predict what the budget's going to be. We can't predict what enrollment's going to be. But what we did, we offered the colleges, we created a spreadsheet where they can plug in numbers. Say, hey, our enrollment's right here. This is what kind of revenue it produces. And this is what the budget might be. And they can plug in and change and kind of see where their cash flows are. And again, just like everything, some of our colleges are in a little better financial position than others, but it's hard to predict the future.
Yeah, and on that same vein, this is not just an issue. This is not something that just LCTCS colleges are, concerned about or have on their radars. It's really all higher ed nationwide, right? So this will be a year of transition for everybody in terms of where enrollments fall out, what those revenues are, and this year, and we ended the year very healthy fiscally. It's just again that thought of planning for the future, where we're going to go.
This to me is the kind of report that internal audit makes huge contributions to the operations side. So the thing I want you to keep in mind is not only are we talking about a federal dollar that came into the system and you've got to now try to figure out how that washed out, but you also are in the midst of a change in where we receive our typical revenue. So typically with 80, 90,000 students enrolled on the credit side, you're picking up about $4,200 per student. Now you're seeing those students vote with their feet and go for short-term training programs that are about $500 average enrollment. 4,200, 500. Now every customer that walked through the door of Walmart, if you will, is paying us somewhere in the neighborhood of about 1/8 of what we were receiving before. So while you have the influx of cash from the feds and then the spend down of the federal money, you also in your traditional revenue streams are looking at dollars coming to us in a very different form than they have historically. The other aspect of that is that a significant portion of credit enrollment, the revenue comes from federal government. But what about the non-credit side? When I go do a rigging training program that's not for credit, that has to come out of the pocket of the individual, or we don't get paid for it. So when you step back from it and look at where revenue is coming from, this is probably the most important thing we've done in a couple of years, because there are colleges that could fall off the table. When you get 1/3 of your total budget in one big opportunity from the federal government, it kind of causes everybody to relax a bit. There'll be a cliff on the other side of this. We got to be paying attention to it. So I appreciate the work.
And more collection challenges on the private pay side than the federal side.
Great question. We have, let me just say it this way, it's different. So Turner Industries, as an example, goes down, they enroll 50 students at Delgado's Fire Training Academy. we're asking you to give us social security numbers. You as an employer aren't interested in giving us social security numbers. So those are some of the issues that come along. And so from a collections point of view, we get paid from Turner Industries, no problem. The challenge becomes that we aren't necessarily able to drill down and say Joe Marine was making this much before the training and this much after the training, because we don't have the data. So we're still working through some of those details to make sure we have what we need to be able to tell us. This also goes hand in glove with the work that we're doing with Regents right now and trying to develop the non-credit policy platform. So all at once, this thing is sort of coming together over about a 5 or 6 year period. It's exciting, but it's also kind of scary if you're running the shop. You know, if you're minding the shop back home and making sure that you've got the revenue that you need to keep this college afloat, it's very different. Sorry, I mean.
No, that's fine. The last thing we did for the fiscal year 23 are our purchase and travel card reviews. This is required by the Department of Administration. If we don't do it, our colleges get written up for not having a card review. So I'm not going to be responsible for our colleges having to respond to a legislative auditor finding. We don't consider this a big risk. That the controls over these cards is pretty stringent. There's a user approver and then another layer of sweep approval. We see minor issues. I only write the colleges up if I feel like it's a systemic issue. Department of Administration will write them up. You know, they'll require write a finding if they have 13 cents of state tax on a transaction. I don't think that's productive. I'll let them do that. If I see systemic issues where multiple issues in our sample, I'll write them up, but we're not seeing that, which is good. In fact, a couple of our colleges, they'll call me about it, but they'll catch the bad transactions. One of our colleges had a fraudulent transaction. They immediately caught it, reported to the credit card company. Card was destroyed, and that before the bill was even due that month, it was off their books. So no funds were misappropriated. Just to make the committee aware, since we last met, we've issued 2 reports, card reports, and that was Bossier Parish Community College and Sewella Technical Community College. Neither had any issues. That's it for the fiscal year 23 wrap up. It doesn't require
Any action?
no.
Okay, any questions, comments? Excellent report.
Great. I'll shift my focus to the future, and it's my first audit plan. So spent a good bit of time and kind of try to put my name on it. The biggest thing I wanted to do is view these audit plans as not fiscal year, as start over and start over. I wanted them to evolve. The issues that we found in the previous fiscal year, I wanted to see how we could bring that into the next and dive even deeper, because that's the issue we have. You know, we have limited resources as a staff. We can't get bogged down too much in one particular report, but there's a lot of times there's still meat on the bone. You know, there's still questions unanswered. And that's what I wanted to do with this particular audit plan, is take what we did in the previous year, because I think we produced some good information, and move forward. So the first thing, and these are identified risks. These aren't particularly projects that are fully fleshed out. These are still a work in progress, but as we go through the year, they'll become more into focus, and we'll update the committee on that. A couple of years ago, we had a quality assessment review as an internal audit shop, and the biggest feedback we got from the review was that we needed to update this committee on our audit plan during our meetings. Previously, we just kind of said what we were working on, but I'm going to address the plan each meeting just real quickly, kind of let you know where it stands. Maybe there's something we removed or added, because this is always, we can change it and we can have a vote to add things or remove things. But first is cybersecurity controls, and these are ranked on risk factors. So cybersecurity is always going to rise to the top these days. And this might not be a traditional audit report. This could be a look back at the CAG 20, now CAG 18, to see where our colleges are. Another idea I've had is seeing where our training is for our colleges. You know, the weak link in your cybersecurity system is your employee. They're constantly hit with phishing, you know, text messages. There's always somebody trying to get in, and They only have to get in one time. You can have 1,000 employees and 999 of them do the right thing. But that one employee does the wrong thing, the bad actors are in. So one of the ideas I had was see where I can have Eric report to this board where our training metrics are. How many people are failing their trainings? How many people are not taking it? See if there's anything to glean from those numbers. Again, I don't know where this is going to take us, but it's always a risk. And I feel like internal audit has some responsibility to spend some time there.
Is such training mandatory for all our employees?
It is mandatory, but it's not like your key card won't work if you don't take it. So it's kind of
The training is mandatory and to Eric's credit, he's probably scared most all the staff, at least in our office, to open up their emails because there are these tests that come out of nowhere on a regular basis, right? They look good and it's really test you to see how you're doing. And you click on it, you get sent, as I say, to fishing school, not fishing school.
Yeah, fishing trips.
Right.
Mike said I could make fun of him for a year. So he got caught on there was a lost dog in the parking lot email he got caught on. Clicked the picture to see the dog and it was a fishing thing. He had to go to fishing training. That's cruel.
He got me at a board meeting.
Yeah, that's cool.
Sitting down about my Amazon order, right? You get that fear, sense of urgency,
Yeah.
and then all of a sudden,
Back to school.
Tricks of the trade.
yes,
That's how it happens.
Yep, exactly.
sense of urgency.
If I may, Jeff, one other thing that falls into this category is kind of a postmortem on any issues that come up. So the one that we just had, I guess probably, what was it, Joe, 3 months ago, that we had the Department of Motor Vehicle hit. We also had a couple of institutions that were impacted. Thankfully, as I shared with this board, there were no documents or data that was shared that was a problem. It was documents that were, for the most part, just day-to-day operations kind of stuff. It was in what we refer to as the network drives, but no student data. But what I would like to ask is internal audit to go in, take a look and see, looking back on this thing, how could we have prevented even that?
Yeah.
So having this as a catch-all category, I think is helpful year in and year out so that we can do some of this work because look, they're not going to stop. This is only going to get.
Oh, no, exactly.
more rigorous.
Yeah. Next thing is financial aid controls. This is, like I said earlier, carried over from the previous fiscal year. And with this one, we've been, over the years, we've kind of punted on financial aid. It's vast. You have a lot of bad actors, again, trying to manipulate or game the system. But finally, we broke down, I tasked Charles with this. I said, let's look at what our colleges are being written up for. I didn't want to just do a full federal financial aid review, but let's concentrate on what our colleges are being written up for, what are colleges around the country being written up for, and let's focus our tests on those areas. So we took the downtime between finishing our previous audit plan and getting this one ready. Charles worked on a financial aid review, which we're currently conducting at Nunez. And we plan to do at least one other college this coming fiscal year. But like I said, it's something we have to do. Our colleges are constantly getting written up. It's a lot of times it's not major issues, but I feel like if there's anything we can do to help and eliminate some of these continuous legislative auditor findings, we've got to at least try. That's my hope. I can't promise that you won't see any more legislative auditor findings over financial aid, but that's the goal.
That's always good.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. Next is we're calling this one staffing. And this is an extension of the HERF project that Joe requested. So again, where are we at with our financially speaking? Are we using our dollars the best way they can? From a staffing perspective, are our rural campuses in a good place compared to our more urban campuses? What do those numbers look like from operating expenditure to enrollment? Is somebody spending a lot more money per the student they serve? Is there a reason for that? To dive into those numbers, like I said, an extension from our HERF project, I think could really be a benefit. One of the things I want to bring into internal audit is more data analytics, more continuous auditing. And I think this is exactly the type of subject or background that can lend itself to that. Give our colleges the resources, again, like we did with HERF, give them a spreadsheet that they can punch numbers in and see where they are. Maybe they can make some adjustments. I'm not talking about, getting rid of people, but maybe it's refocusing your efforts, moving people around.
Yeah, and with that said too, there's also this realization that, what is an adequate staffing level for a function to be done? That provides redundancy, checks and balances, and just some bench depth, right? Which is one of the challenges that our smaller campuses have. Whether you have 5 employees or 500 employees to do HR payroll functions, you need X amount of people just to provide those checks and balances. So hopefully that'll be one of the things also brought in to kind of give a comparative review of staffing levels across colleges based on their function and obviously their resources. But regardless, there's some things that you need staff. So this will flush it out.
Yep, and I'm anxious to see the results. Next is what we're calling restricted fees. And again, it's an evolution of carrying over from previous fiscal year. This comes from the agency accounts. When we started working on that project with the amounts held in custody, we noticed there was some accounting irregularities with restricted fees. So it's something we want to look into. These restricted fees, this is your tech fee, your building use fee, SGA, academic excellence. Our colleges have a large balance of these funds. I think right now it's somewhere around $60 million. And there's restrictions on these fees. And I get a lot of questions from our colleges about, hey, we had this fee, it's built up a large balance, and we don't really want to use it for what we said 10 years ago. What can we do? So again, it's kind of an evolution of those amounts held in custody. I think we can provide some resources to our colleges and answer those questions and hopefully find no issues. But it is a risk because, like I said, the balance is high and we're getting questions. So there's obviously some issues that they're working through. Next is, and for our compliance project, this is an extension of CLARI. I'm going to do the American with Disabilities Act this year. I'm going to approach it the same way I did with the CLARI Act. I'm going to send out a survey. I've identified 20 key components from the law and to see where our colleges stand. I'm not going to go out and I'm not going to be measuring door frames or pulling on doors. And there's a place for that, but I'm going to focus my time and effort on trying to find those blind spots from our colleges. The CLARI project really opened my eyes. There's a lot of stuff our colleges aren't doing, but real simple fixes. And lastly is the purchase cards and travel cards, which we're required to do from the Division of Administration. Again, we're not seeing any major issues there, but it's something we're going to continue to do. I'm shooting for 1 a quarter. So you have the document passed out. You'll see the last page is kind of how we rank our risks and how this things fall into order. Without diving too deep in it, it's we weight it, where the risk came from, can fraud be involved, compliance environment, how many times the entity has been audited, all those contribute and it gives us a number and we just rank them based on those risk factors. I know one thing I want to address, I know that when you see, you might see a Fortune 500 company, they'll have a risk assessment and it'll have 200 items on it. We approach things a little differently. I don't know if it's productive to create this large risk assessment and it's stuff that we can't do. What we try to do is identify the areas that we can have an impact on and present those risks to you as a committee and just limit it to that. In the past, we make these large risk assessments and it's like, okay, well, these are everything we can't do. And also it kind of points out maybe our weak areas, which I don't think is necessary to broadcast. But most of these projects and why there's so few are system-wide projects. And those are a tremendous undertaking because you're dealing with 12 colleges and probably 2 or 3 main points of contact for each college. So it's a scheduling issue. You're getting a lot of information and it's a massive undertaking, but I want the committee to know that a lot of work goes into these. And while the quantity is not there, the quality is, and I think that's important. We could come up with a risk assessment. I could spit out 40 audit reports next year, and not one of them will mean anything. It'll be a bunch of purchase card type, simple compliance stuff. But I think the department, especially under Mike's leadership, and he's passed it on to me, we want to have impact. Like Joe mentioned, we had a project that produced a policy change. We have projects where people, when you issue a report and they call and ask questions about it and want to know more, I think those are the type of projects that we want to be involved in. That's it for the audit plan for fiscal 24.
Sure. Sure. Jump in real quick. Let's go back to when you said SGA, all my bills went off. But I understand how, because I'm a student, I pay those fees. I understand. And when I became president, I was like, well, I'll let money go. Because it just sit there.
Yeah.
And a lot of times we can't spend that money with SGA. We purchase things for the students. But are you planning on making a policy change where each school can take that fund and do, something else with it?
The SGA funds are the students' funds. So you and your voting committee for the SGA has.
I'm just saying for any like I'm looking at my fee sheet, I got fees forever. So you saying like if a particular group has a lot of money, can they want to change the policy where they can use that money for something else that the school might need?
Yes, what they would like, if it's like a dormant fund or a fund that's not being used, what they can do is give it to SGA, and SGA can vote on what to use those funds with. It's not carte blanche, but there's certain items that have to be followed. But that would be the recommendation: is these dormant funds that are sitting there, change the bylaws, whatever they were, allow SGA to take them over, and hopefully they'd have, because that would be a direct impact to students.
Yes. Okay, I see.
Just a quick example, just so you understand the context here. One of the original programs at Delgado in the 1920s was an aviation program. So they started an aviation club. Today, Delgado doesn't have an aviation program any longer, and so they don't have an aviation club. They probably have $250 in an account. But when you have 40 or 50 or 60 of those across the system that came in at different points in time where fees were different, you just have a dollar value sitting there and you can't do anything with it because Delgado has a hard time finding a way to spend money on aviation. So that's more the circumstance that we're faced with. We want to be sure that we resolve the original intent, or that we stay true to the original intent, but we resolve the challenge that we have right now, which is we can't spend it.
Is there a legislative auditor? From the legislative auditor's position, is there some basic guideline or suggestion?
Well, I think that was the reason of the crux of the matter for the policy changes, because the policy change from the system level was silent on that. It didn't discuss that issue. So in the absence of any board approved policy that would provide guidance and coverage, everybody was just sitting back holding on to the money because they didn't have a button to hit to figure out what to do with the funds. The change provides that now for them going forward, and has for the last 4 or 5 months. So they now have that coverage to do that without being worried about what happens with legislative auditors coming in and so forth. They have that protection.
Right, and to speak a little more on that, with the fees, like a tech fee, colleges need to be sure, and we'll see if they are, a lot of times when they start these fees, they have these big plans, or they say, hey, we're going to get together every 3 months and vote on how to spend this money. Well, time goes on and they stop doing that, but they're still spending the money. So you need to make sure they're following what they originally laid out. I know years ago, one of our colleges, we had that issue. They were spending their tech fee, but it was kind of in contradiction to what the committee said. And they're like, oh, well, our committee hadn't met in 2 years. So there's issues like that. It's not malfeasance, but it's just, something you can get written up for. And if we can prevent that, that's the goal.
And if I can just add something on the restricted fees, the academic excellence fee, the technology fee, building use fee are the 3 big ones, but they are also regulated by the statutes. So you can only spend those in accordance with what's provided in in the revised statutes.
Gotcha.
So that, and then that ends up being non-compliance with the law if you're not following those rules.
Bishop, you need a motion to approve?
Staff recommends that the audit committee of the LCTCS Board of Supervisors approve the proposed audit plan for fiscal year 23-24 as presented by the internal audit director to be effective upon approval through June 30, 24.
Okay. I
Motion
see
to
a
back.
motion, second. Is there any objection to the motion as presented? Hearing none, that motion passes. I'd like to ask Joe Marin, please, then to review the legislative order.
Right, and just a little bit of a primer on legislative audit reports. So as you heard, Mike is still here. Jeff, an internal audit throughout the year, do their internal audits and things of that nature. We also have external auditors, a legislative auditor's office that comes in and audits our colleges. And as they issue reports, they don't necessarily issue them all at one time. They will issue them as they get them done. So they start the process. Actually, they're starting now for fiscal year 23 in terms of gathering information, but then they get that information, they audit it, they compile their reports, they have their review process that takes place and so forth. And they start issuing reports roughly around February, March throughout the year. So the reason I mention that is it's you will see that we will come before you with an audit report for maybe a handful of colleges, not all of them, because we're giving them to you as they come out. So with that said, the last one to come out for fiscal year 22 was Baton Rouge Community College. It was just issued this last June. And they had 3 audit findings. Most of them are related to procedural integrity issue, focus. We mentioned about Title IV financial aid, Pell, which is always an exposure point, not just for us, but for all of higher ed, given the breadth of accounts that you're dealing with, student records. In this case, the auditor's office made note that they did a non-statistical sample. So it's not something that they can necessarily project out to the whole, but still in pulling samples, they found some minor issues related to when funds are returned or they calculated correctly. In the report itself, the dollar values look very small, a couple $100, maybe $1,000 at most, but that's because they only pulled a handful of records. So they wrote a finding. The college has responded that they are going to continue to provide training to employees for the processing of financial aid. But again, it just goes back to like Lucille Ball of the Chocolate Factory. You're dealing with things coming out so fast that things unfortunately slip by. We need to do a better job. And Jeff, that may be one of the colleges you follow up on. Thanks for the intro, right? The next one had to do with controls over payroll. Again, it was a non-statistical sampling of payroll timesheets and so forth, pulling a handful, actually, 1 out of 20, 1 out of 24, 1 out of 2, and so forth, where they found just little things that were passing through and needed to be checked. And HR has committed to, again, training their staffs in terms of the process for payroll to make sure that again, a procedure is not only laid out, it is laid out, but that they are indeed following it. And lastly, the last finding they got had to do with HERF reporting. All colleges were required federally, nationally, to report to the federal government in terms of the use of the HERF funds. Baton Rouge Community College missed some deadlines. The data was not the issue, it was the fact that they just missed some deadlines on these reports. And again, they've committed to making sure that their financial staff are knowledgeable about reporting timely. HERF has ceased this last June, so it's not going to be necessarily a HERF reporting issue, but it's just in general, they have to be on top of reports required by the federal government. So with that said, that's the audit report for BRCC, the last one to come out for fiscal year 22. I would like to note and gratefully thank the Legislative Auditor's Office for their commitment to helping us with our 2 colleges that are seeking SACS accreditation. As I mentioned, their workload begins and they start issuing reports normally in the February-March timeframe through the rest of the summer. Given the timeline that those 2 colleges, Central and Northwest, have for SACS accreditation, we made a request, which some might think was unreasonable. I personally think one of them might be a little tight, but they have committed to giving us audit reports at an earlier time frame so that we can have those reports ready for SACS to help them with that SACS accreditation process. Central, for fiscal year 23, which is just ending, they are committing to having a report issued by February of 24. So that one is a little bit early. The one that is very early for Northwest is for fiscal year 23, they're going for March of 24, which is reasonable. But for fiscal year 24, they're shooting for October, that following October. So that's a very, very tight timeline to have to get in, get the books, audit them, issue a report, and go through that whole review process. But again, I just want to make it publicly noted for the auditor's office. I thank them for their time and commitment to helping us get those goals so we can get this process started and reach SACS accreditation.
Phil, if I may, one thing to keep in mind about Northwest, the last legislative audit report that was just issued was the first full scope audit the college has ever been through.
Right.
Let that sink in, right?
First?
So the first. So when we did this with Central 4 years ago, Joe, I think 3 years or 4 years ago, they went through their first full scope audit. That's a big deal, right? To have to stand back, think about it differently, because before, if you remember, they were all part of regional technical colleges. And so we did one audit for the state. We didn't do a full scope for the institution. So when Northwest made it through this last audit with only minor findings, that was a huge step forward. Now what we're doing is kind of like the Evel Knievel thing. You think that jump was something? What? Wait.
We're all in Vegas.
Well, right, but what we've just done is we tighten the timeline, and the stakes are even higher because accreditation is so. But you know, guys, looking back on it, several of you around this table can recall when we had 16 institutions, and we had about 8 or 9 of those that were SACS accredited. Several of them that were accredited by COE. So we've been down this path for a while now. We're down now to the very last 2, and the big hurdle in front of us is audit. So I just want to make sure everybody knows that's the big piece. Every time I talk to Chancellor Spillers, the first question is, how are we doing? How's the audit? It's not the SACS accreditation piece, it's the audit piece that is a big challenge. So I know you are seeing a lot of that in person, right?
Yes, sir.
And just to provide some perspective, they have management letters issued for those colleges. Normally the ones that are very small, they're not necessarily material as relates to the entire system. So it's not that they're getting a review necessarily, but it's just not a full scope audit. But it's a different ballgame when you go to a full scope audit. And so.
Can I just add one thing too, to maybe add a little perspective to the student financial aid programs? Because when Joe mentions that there were $200 or $300 that were found, and that results in a finding, and then sometimes people will think that the auditors are being petty. Part of the issue is that the restrictions that the feds have on audits of federal programs and Pell Grants, I think, are about $100 million or so a year in revenues. And the federal requirements are that if you have findings that result in what are referred to as known question costs, that is known errors, of $25,000 or more, then you have to write a finding, 25,000 out of 100 million. And the other one is if you have likely question costs of that same amount. So that's a very low threshold. Then to put it in an even broader perspective, the Medicaid program from the state is I don't know how many billions of dollars now, and they have that same $25,000 requirement. So that's across the board. They have a very, very low threshold from the federal government standpoint. So it's quite possible to still see those kinds of findings, even though controls overall are functioning fairly well. We'll just say that.
This is $25,000 threshold. Yet in our current scenario for repairing and making Social Security stable, there's enough fraud, waste, and abuse to sustain the program in 8 years. So just let that sink in. We have a $25,000 threshold, but yet we're going to save Social Security on fraud, waste, and abuse. There's no way that a $25,000 threshold has that much of an improvement. But all right, let's see, Joe, are you squared away?
Yes,
You
sir.
all done? Okay,
Yes.
thank you. All right, Jeff, you want to review the other reports?
That's it for legislative audit reports. The H.
Okay. Are there any questions or any other business come before the committee?
You still do all these, work with, internal staff, with LCTCS employees, and what I'm saying, is we don't contract this out, to anybody?
No, currently no. But
What you got, what kind of team you got right now?
well, right now it's myself and Charles. We have an intern and we're interviewing for a senior internal auditor. Put that out to anybody I see. If you know anybody who's interested, even if they have a data background, that's something we're trying to bring into, like I mentioned, you stepped out during that.
That's
piece.
right.
But because I feel like I can teach somebody how to audit who has that data background as opposed to an auditor. It's hard for me to teach them how to do that data analytic background. So anybody you know, send them my way. But that's the plan right now. I find the department functions, rather than have a lot of people at the staff level, have fewer people who are experienced and can handle audits on their own. Charles has more experience than any auditor I know. I can set him out on his ways and he can do the audit and he can get it done and produce a report to me that I review. I obviously can handle reports myself. That's the type of people we're trying to bring in. I just find that the way we function, it's better with fewer people, but we can target and handle these system-wide projects. And that's just, yeah, I'm sure everybody would want more resources, but the reality of the situation is that's not where we are. But and Dr. Sullivan let me know when we were going over this, if there's any time I identify where we do need more people, especially with that data background, we can have that discussion. But that's the update on where the department is.
Fair enough.
Okay, any other questions or comments?
Yeah, great work. This is a great report, great look into the crystal ball for 24 and very much.
Sterling
We all
President.
got you back. And for the millennials in the room who don't know who Evil is.
Or I like you see.
Yeah. But he will be able to break everybody's ways. I didn't know him so bad.
Supervisor too. Dr. Sullivan, do you have any other comments?
Oh, man, please.
Excellent report, as always. Good job. We're real proud of you. The chair will entertain a motion to adjourn.
So move.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any objection? Motion passes.
Really?
Lucy at the is
Tuesday, the Carol for that.
And now they want to talk about Carol Burnett, really?
Okay, then.
I still watch all of this.